समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Welcome to the Worldview with Swasti. As you know, Donald Trump is on an official visit to China after 9 years. Now, there is much on the agenda, but the pressing concern right now is the Iran war. Now, Trump, for his part, has appeared unbothered by China's close relationship with Tehran. Now, while the US has recently sanctioned a China-based refinery for importing Iranian oil, but if you ask Donald Trump, he has always downplayed any Chinese support. Again, it is interesting because the Iranian foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, went to Beijing last week, and this also shows a kind of a connection that we'll try to understand today. And for the record, Abbas Araghchi is today in New Delhi for the BRICS Foreign Ministers Summit. Now, very quickly, we know that there is much to unpack on the status of the Iran war, the blockade of the Hormuz, and the newly discovered strikes on Iran by not only the United Arab Emirates, but also other countries of the Gulf. Now, to understand this better, I have the right expert. I have Dr. Professor Rasheed Amjed, who teaches defense studies at the King's College in London, and he's also a fellow of the Middle Eastern Studies. Now, Amjad, welcome to the Worldview. I believe this is your first outing with us, so we so much look forward to having this conversation. And if I can just begin with where we are right now. So, like I said, Mr. Donald Trump is in China after 9 years. And what do you think can he extract from Xi Jinping there for Iran? And of course, there is a subtext there that he might be having to give up something on Taiwan. But how do you look at the Middle Eastern part?
Thank you very much for having me, Swati. It's a pleasure to be hosted by you. So, as you rightly mentioned, those two contexts are actually linked to each other, and it's very much hard for us to separate them both. In fact, we have analysts saying, the best way to de-escalate the tension between Beijing and Washington is for Washington to allow China to establish economic presence in the Middle East, and this by default will basically decrease the tension in the Indo-Pacific and so on. So the connection between the two is actually inseparable. That's for sure. But clearly, both of the leaders have red lines. One of the red line is Taiwan for Xi Jinping, clearly. But the other red line also for Trump is, Iran has to be defeated. Iran has to come on board based on his terms, because otherwise he will be seen as weak domestically, but also internationally weak as well. Especially now, we're speaking of NATO being cracked from within, and there are debates whether the Europeans should have their own ways of defense and so on. And the Iran war seems to be the context or the war that tests this leadership of Donald Trump, whether he can do things without his partners and so on. And if he succeeds to do that, the European will be then convinced that actually he's the one still in charge and so on. So clearly, for Xi Jinping, Taiwan is a red line, but and that Trump, all his obsession, if this is the correct way of saying it, is to strike a deal with China. I mean, if you look at the delegation, you would realize that actually much of it is to strike an economic deal, trade deal with China. But at the same time, Trump also knows that he cannot jeopardize Taiwan. It's not only about Taiwan; it's about U.S. grand strategy in the Indo-Pacific, and we're speaking of Japan, we're speaking of range of countries that the U.S. has established long relations with them, but also not only the regional countries, but also beyond that. We're speaking of AUKUS, for instance, which include New Zealand, Canada, the UK, Australia, and so on. We speak of the Five Eyes. So this goes beyond the region. So
Yeah.
this will be something that Trump will think twice before compromising anything that is in front. Compromise the Taiwanese card. He would be very careful to not to send any wrong message to its partner in the region. So yes, it will be a red line for both of them, but I don't see that Trump is going to compromise. He's not going to trade Taiwan for Iran, that's for sure. And what he's going
Right.
to say is basically that the Hormuz Strait is closed, and if we open it, it's a zero-sum game for the two of us. Mr. Xi, let's agree on this.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because, of course, and I'm glad you mentioned that term there, which was to do with America's grand strategy. And this is something that in Trump's era we tend to forget because he's just become so knee jerk and he's so fixated on the decisions he takes that sometimes the strategic community at large just loses the sight of the grand strategy that the American state has. And thanks for circling back there, but. You mentioned the war in Iran and how this is a project for Donald Trump, and he doesn't want to be looked upon as somebody who's defeated there or somebody who's come out weakened. Now, let me ask you a little bit on the current update there, because we know that one of the things that Scott Bessent, for example, has been saying repeatedly is that it is in China's interest to push Iran to lift that blockade from the Strait of Hormuz, right? But then we also know that China is relatively more insulated because of its vast strategic reserves. Now, just help me understand, Amjad, here about the blockade. It's a double blockade, right? While no loadings have been recorded on the Kurg Island for the last few days, but at the same time, it doesn't mean to say that the rest of the GCC have been able to export from there like they used to. What does it show for Iran? I mean, Iran certainly, in an asymmetric way, has been able to play this card, hasn't it? Where do you see this as? It started on 28th of February. Now we are speaking on the 14th of May. Where do you see this as?
I think the Iranians have, miscalculated this blockade of Hormuz Strait, and they have taken it further than it should. And clearly, it fires back now. Reports are saying that actually Iranians are not selling their oils either because this is everybody is damaged because of the war, and the Iranians are despite besides the sanctions, and now they are under double siege basically. So the Americans have played the issue very well, I think. And it's world politics. After all, the currency of world politics is military power, and the Americans have the upper hand. And yes, we could argue that the Iranians have the quote unquote the strategic patience. They have fought a war against Iraq for 8 years, and they went out of its triumph. We could argue that actually they could expand what they had. The war, to the neighboring countries and so on and so forth, which again, it's the future is going to backfire to Tehran as well. But I think the Iranians, if you look at the big picture, if you look at maybe not even at the operational level, at the not at the strategic level, but at the operational level, where are the command and control of the Iranian? The military commands have been decapitated. The political command has been, political leadership has been systematically assassinated with this targeted assassination. So the Iranians are actually weaker than most of the media actually depict them. And Kharaj, island itself, the scenario tells us that actually they are willing to compromise, and and I think they will. Down the road, this is something that the Iranian cannot push this further. They will come up with a way to say, Xi Jinping called us because of the Chinese interest and so on and so forth. We are going to ease the tensions in Hormuz Strait and so on. They will come up with a way to say, to save face, but down the road, I think they will strike a deal with Donald Trump sooner or later, because this is going to be a very expensive business for them. I mean, if you think about it, it's very hard from their position to strike a deal with the Americans as well. They have been trying so much to disassociate the U.S. Ties with Israel. So trying to deal with Americans in a way that they are not necessarily, or they're not necessarily putting the Iranians and the Americans and the Israelis in the same box. They're trying to separate them to strike a deal, because after all, if you look at the legitimacy of this entire regime since 1979 is anti-Israel, anti-America narrative. So if you strike a deal, then by default you are weakening your legitimacy. So they are going to come up with a way to say, we struck a deal with Donald Trump for the sake of regional stability, for the sake of economic stability, and so on and so forth. This is what I think is going to happen sooner or
No,
later.
that's yeah. No, I mean that's my own reading of the situation, Amjad. That militarily speaking, of course, this has been an unprecedented blow to Iranian military capabilities. Now, because for blockading the Strait of Hormuz, you do not require conventional, capabilities. All you require is certain asymmetric, threat and a perception of the threat, and that is where I guess the whole world remains destabilized. But this should not be conflated with how the military operation per se has gone. What it does not resolve, however, and I think you would agree with me here, is the larger strategic picture with respect to where is the enriched uranium, who's going to be taking charge of that, what happens to Iran's nuclear program, and those are questions I think that are not resolved as of now. But I want to ask you something which I think you must be watching very closely, which is that not just the Emiratis, but also Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries have struck Iran militarily when the military part of this operation was on. Now, this is definitely something a bit counterintuitive. In fact, when it first came, a lot of people rejected and dismissed it as conspiracy theories, because the reading is that it is America's war, it is Donald Trump's war, and at best it's baby Netanyahu's war, in the region. So the rest of the GCC would not like to be dragged into it, and I think that's part true. But then what really explains the other fighter jets carrying out strikes inside of Iran, and where do you see this takes the future relationship between the GCC and Iran, because that is a neighborhood that they have to live together in?
Add to the equation Iraq as well, and the
Yeah,
Kuwait.
please do that. Yes, please do that. Yeah.
So it came as a surprise, to be frank, because giving my own communication with Gulfi officials, military officials, and diplomatic officials, the Kuwaitis and the Bahrainis have been on the front line to strike back. What the country that asked for restraint is Saudi Arabia and MBS, saying no, this is an American-Israeli war. We should disassociate ourselves from, and so on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, a few days later, if you remember, New York Times published a story saying that actually MBS is pushing the Americans to finish this war, maybe once and for all, because it has become really, really expensive. So it came as a surprise, the Reuters report on Emiratis, Saudis and Kuwaiti jets targeting some locations where they believe that actually drones came from, and ballistic missiles, and also inside Iraq, which is, if you think about it, this hasn't been the case for so long. Iraq now, obviously, the Gulfis have not declared this, and restraint and de-escalation has been this official discourse. But then, if you think about it now, actually, this is an act of war, and can you blame them for that? Because it's the Iranians have been targeting, not as they claim, American targets in the region, American bases, but airports, civilian facilities, and so on and so forth. Look at the Kurdish region in Iraq, the rest of the Gulfis and so on have been targeted massively by the Iranian missiles and drones. So it came as a surprise, but not a surprise at the same time, because this is a statecraft, and the message that they are going to send is that maybe the Americans will not come to protect us against your missile strikes and drones, even though we have massively invested in defense systems and so on. Maybe it's time for us to establish this local or domestic capabilities and establish deterrence down the road to basically tell the Iranians, no, you can stop here. I mean, we can also strike back and strike painfully, and this is the message. I think it came at a good time, and the Iranians probably they'll have to think twice that you don't want to make everybody as your enemy, and
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And what does it also then tell us about how the defense modernization of the Gulf is going to look like? Because one of the things that has happened is that the deterrence that it created for all these years with the American backstop and
Yeah.
with investing in very expensive platforms, that deterrence failed. So they have to create a new deterrence, and we do see inputs like President Zelensky being there and the drone partnerships now emerging here and there. But that's just perhaps one part of how the tactical preparedness is now going to look like. Generally, how do you, in your assessment, and I know that this is something that you closely work on, what do you think are the contours of defense modernization of the Gulf as well as the Levant, right, going to look like? Where do you think the money is going to flow?
Oh dear, lots of money. You probably you know this as well. The Saudis have been working on it actually before the war. The localization projects of SAM as part of 2030 MBS vision of we need to establish a new self-reliant Saudi Arabia when it comes to military and so on and so forth. So we're speaking of over $60 billion that the Saudis are actually investing in domestic industry. And that's a message. It tells that we are not only progressing, but also we are self-reliant now. And we are in that way. Following pretty much the Turkish experience of, 20 years from now, the Turks were not, they were exporting everything, but look at them now. They are selling Bayraktar drones across the globe. So they are following the same route. The Emiratis have been also on the front line, over $20 billion dollar invested in modernization, localization of military capabilities, and so on and so forth. Elevating professional military education to the strategic level, which for so long has been only in tactical and operational level, where you could argue about the regime stability and keeping the military on check as well, and so on. But now things are, as me being at the heart of professional military education, can tell you that actually they are thinking of, now strategically more than any time before. And my sense is that the rest of the GCC countries are going to follow suit, because yes, probably when it comes to punishment, you have denial, and you have when it comes to deterrence, you have denial and punishment. You probably might not be able to deny any Iranian attacks, but you clearly can show that you can hit back, and punishment, and that element will basically make the Iranian think twice in the future, because I think, and you would agree with me on this, 7 October attacks and all what followed right after that, it shows anything that actually the region before this war is not going to be the region after this war. And part of this is, those countries finally realizing that actually statecraft, finally realizing that actually realism is unfortunately what dominates world politics. And if you don't help yourself, nobody will help you out. God help those who help themselves, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that whatever's happening in the Gulf region right now it's pretty much a paradigm shift, because there is no going back to status quo ante. And this is something that we all have to keep in mind, because, I mean, I'm sitting in New Delhi. My country has been multi-aligning with a lot of actors across, Arabia, Persia, and the Levant. And however, we are going to be sort of mindful of how our interests are now distributed in the region. But like I said, that, there is no going back to the status quo ante. Now, there's one more thing I'd like to ask you, because I think you've been, you're just the right person for it. And I know that we started our discussion with this, which is the Kurdish question. And I have to ask you this because Mr. Donald Trump, it got on everybody's attention when he was quite angry with the Kurds. And he said that, oh, they have betrayed us. I mean, anybody that really understands what the Americans have been doing with the Kurds, how they've been using the Kurds to fight the ISIS in Iraq and Syria, would know that the reality is the other way around, right? It's the Kurds that feel betrayed with what has happened. And you can obviously go at length and tell me more about Syria and the new government under al-Shara, etc. But just help us understand what makes Donald Trump make this tone-deaf statement about Kurds, because it is impossible, that all Kurdish groups are weaponized the same way by the CIA, and they all start a revolt at the same time, along with the Azeris and Balochis, to really, destabilize the Iranian regime from within. I mean, that's a preposterous and is kind of a, ridiculous kind of an idea, and nobody in their right minds would even entertain that. Please help us understand, where is this coming from? Because it's a much deeper question. Please unpack it for us, Amjed.
Yeah. Well, so this goes way back, if you go to the history of the Kurdish cause and the recurrent U.S. betrayal of the Kurdish cause is, the tail is very long, Swati. You probably need more than one podcast for
Maybe
this.
I get you back only for the Kurdish question, but yes, yeah.
With pleasure. Clearly, I mean, what happened in Rojava or the Kurdish part of Syria, it was just a few months ago of U.S. betrayal of the Kurdish SDF that have fought alongside with them against ISIS and so on, and for so long, the Allied forces led by the Americans have been walking around freely, clearly
Amjad,
established.
let me just stop you. Also, for the benefit of the Indian viewers who are not very familiar with the region, could you also just help them understand what is the larger Kurdish questions? I mean, here is a transnational group that is spread over different countries in the region. So please, could you just tell us a little bit of the basics also, because you're an expert of that. Yes. Sorry to butt in,
Well,
but I just thought it would benefit the viewers. Yeah.
yeah, no, absolutely. So the issue started with the establishment of the modern Middle East, or modern West Asia, North Africa, right after the First World War, and basically the introduction of the nation state system, which for so long, or which we could. The argument is that it's oxygenous process. It was lands were drawn on the sands based on the interest of the colonial powers, Britain and France at the same at that time, and so on and so forth. So what this peculiar movement, I would say, put into what this caused basically is the repartition of the Kurdish territory. I mean, Kurdistan has never been a state as of in the modern form of state, the Weberian state of land, community, and state and government and so on. But they have lived in this region for so long, and then all of a sudden you see this establishment of national state system and hard borders, and what it ended up doing is basically dividing the Kurdish land or Kurdish communities living on those land into 4 countries: Iran, Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. And the majority of the Kurds live in Turkey, or more than 20 million, I think. And then you have some 8 million or so, roughly speaking, in Iran. And then you have 5 to 6 million in Iraq, and 2-3 million roughly in Syria. Put them together, we're speaking of 40 million population, the largest probably community without a state. And that, since then, this has been, the Kurdish cause has been at the heart of Middle East policy, along with Arab-Israeli conflict. So this is in a short history of it. The first betrayal of the U.S. with the Kurds was actually in the 70s, where Henry Kissinger struck the deal with the Shah and the Algerian Hawari Boumediene back then. Saddam Hussein made the Shah, and basically the Shah cuts ties and support with the American supporting the Kurdish rebels in the north of Iraq, the Kurdish region. And one thing led to another. Basically, the rebel was cracked. A lot of those historical pages that the stories that I'm sharing it with you are actually very similar to what's happening now. The Kurds have always have recurrently historically been the scapegoat of a much bigger much bigger structural question. They have been continuously compromised when it comes to power, great power competition. You understand this because if you think China, Russia, and America are the one who shape the bigger picture, then the rest will follow suit. Now, obviously, we have India, we have BRICS, countries emerging as alternative structures to the main structure of great power competition. So you have this betrayal of the Americans, of the Kurds in Syria a few months ago, basically saying that there will be no. You need to strike a deal with Ahmed al-Shara in Dimashq. He's the sovereign, and so on and so forth. We strike a deal with him. It's a much bigger deal with the Israelis. That's for sure. So coming to the Kurdish rebels, let's put it this way, who resides in Iraqi Kurdistan, but they are from Iranian Kurdistan, so they are in exile. They are in war in a cold war with the central government. So the idea was, the only way to topple down the regime, because it's no longer about the country not having a nuclear program, is actually maybe it's time for the regime to go. The only way to remove the regime in Tehran is to have boots on the ground. Now, you cannot have American boots on the ground. You can have them for 60 days based on the Constitution, U.S. Constitution. You could do that as a commander-in-chief, as a president, and then you have 30 days to pull them back. But actually, you need a Congress for something bigger than airstrike from the sky. So the idea was maybe we should fund those groups, and they disrupt the central government, similar to the Iraqi scenario after 1991. They control certain areas, and maybe weaken the central government. Something like this was utterly rejected by the Kurdish rebels, the Kurdish fighters who reside in Iraqi Kurdistan, precisely because they are afraid that the US will betray them. Now, Donald Trump might stay here for extra few years, but the Iranians will not go, from anywhere.
So you mean to say that they were never armed?
Leaders have also.
Yeah. So you mean to say that they were never armed? I mean, all the news of the CIA, arming the Kurdish groups, that was not true in the first place. Those were all conspiracy theories.
I think they have always been communication with those. The Kurdish rebels can deny this up until they won't. But there has always been communication with the Kurds and Mossad when it comes to that.
Yeah.
Arming them might potentially have happened, but not to this that Donald Trump has actually speculated. I think, has been, very insulting to say that, we have armed you and now you stole, because I don't know if you follow the news that actually we armed them, but they stole the weapons. This has not been the case. The American generals themselves have confirmed that actually what Donald Trump is saying is complete nonsense. And the Kurds have, now realized that actually it was a good call not to engage with the war with Iran. I mean, this is not our war after all. As you mentioned at the very, very beginning, is that actually this is Bibi's war, Trump's war against the Iranian regime.
Thanks for elaborating on that, Amjad, because of course it's a complex question, and it really takes an expert like you to help us understand the nuances and the nitty-gritties, because not all of that is covered in the media reporting. But it does make me wonder, and it does make me speculate a little bit on what consequences is this going to have then on the stability, this whole question of the stability of the Iranian regime from within. What about the minorities? We know that there is a problem. I mean, I speak to so many in the region, and they tell me that in the face of economic troubles which are growing, the sky high inflation, the rial not doing well, naturally the only lifeline they had was their oil exports, and which are now under so much strain because of America's blockading of the Hormuz. Now, just sort of help me place it in the larger question of the stability narrative that the IRGC
Yeah.
has, which is a very hyper securitized and yet stable regime, which is, with a very I would say intense potential to crack down on any kind of dissent. And yet there is a Kurdish question, there are Baloch, there are also Azeris and so on.
Mm.
So help us out, give us an insider's view of how would this equation looking? Is it absolutely not impacted at all, or is it something which is simply hidden very well from the rest of the world?
Mm. My only concern with the war walls, and I think you would share this with me, is that hitting from above, from the sky, could potentially backfire. I mean, this
Okay.
you don't know where you are going to be hit, so that could potentially reconcile relations between the society and the regime. I'm not saying they have reconciled. No, in fact, a lot of the Iranians in the diaspora you speak to, they said, you know what,
Yeah.
my family called me, and whenever the American hits it, actually they take one of those quote unquote, according to them, bad guys.
Yeah.
So clearly there is a legitimacy deficit of the Iranian regime. The Iranians are obsessed. Their existential crisis is actually their own people, and that if there is any weaknesses from within, then this is it. And I think it is going to happen, whether sooner or later. Now, those minorities, historically, we could argue that actually they didn't have really problem among each other, at least not at the political sense. So there is some sense of solidarity between those communities. I think what unifies them is that this regime has to go.
Okay.
But this is not an easy issue, Swati. We're speaking of
Yes.
at least 40,000 people have been killed in the January February protest. Those reports are saying that actually the IRCG and the security forces used to go to hospitals and kill and assassinate injury patients in the hospital. What does this tell? If it tells anything, that actually, it's fighting the existential war. We've seen this happening with Saddam Hussein. We've seen this happening with
Yeah.
other presidents and so on. I think this is the final war, and the regime has to either go or has to, pull back, or has to, come up with a Gorbachev prostroika of, somebody
Yeah.
comes up and okay, we say, we maybe have to do something, a reform, gradual, incremental. There is no way that this regime is going to sustain. I don't see it happening. I could be completely wrong, but it's very
Yeah.
hard. It's hard, expensive, and expensive business for them to maintain stability. Given now, okay, maybe you can get some money out of from the Iraqis, because they
Yeah.
can still sell oil and so on. But to what extent?
Yeah.
I mean, even the Americans are aware of this, and they're putting sanctions against the Iraqis. But now with Kharj, and with the crisis of Hormuz, no money coming, and so on and so forth, I think the Americans, probably for me, blocking Hormuz Strait is much more effective than
Yeah.
hitting airstrikes. Yes, you could
Right.
argue that actually now they have, probably rearmed themselves. We speak of over 30,000 sites of, ballistic missiles that the Iranians reports are at least arguing that they still have 30,000 sites where they, can launch drones and ballistic missiles. But yes, what is the strategic outcome out of this? And I think the Iranians are aware of this. Obviously, the hardliners are now on the front line, the IRCG. But there are
Yeah.
politicians who are actually saying, we need to rethink twice about this. Rouhani
Yeah.
is one of those guys. But only future will tell us whether this scenario is going to happen. It's very hard for me to see that the Iranian regime recovering from this war and go back
Okay.
to this might that they used to have 6 months ago,
Right.
if it's fair to say.
Right. No, I mean, on that note, I have to, thank you, Amjad, because this is a complex phenomena, and you also see that the world opinion on this matter is so sharply divided. I mean, there are some that have that have labeled the entire operation as a failure because there is no regime change, and there are others that understand the nuances of what makes the regime stay and what are the long-term challenges for the regime. And I think we are at this stage speculating and sort of, crystal ball gazing into the future because this is a very destabilizing thing. I think on another occasion, I would like to ask you more about, for example, the fate of Iraq and also the other success story in the Levant, which is Syria. I mean, I've been watching that country and the manner in which it has projected itself as a transit hub and doing this fine balancing between United States, Turkey, Israel, UAE, and we all know how it has radically changed its fortunes after the fall of Assad. And I would have asked you, about it, but then maybe we hold it for another time. But at this stage, I have to thank you, Professor Amjed Rasheed, for taking the time out and helping us understand a region which is extremely complex. And you, being from the region, and now, with all the expertise that you've developed on it, I can only thank you from the bottom of my heart. So thank you for taking the time out for us.
My pleasure. Anytime, Swati. Thank you for having me.
All right. And you keep watching The Worldview with Swasti. We are going to be back again with yet another episode.